Good evening, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata here, doing a unplanned live. I happen to have some time. I'm joined by my co-host, my friend. He was lively and awake just a minute ago. Now that the camera has come on, Chauncey's decided to. Lazy. But this is Chauncey. Many of you have heard, few have seen. The family is out of town for the weekend, so I am by myself, which quickly devolves into me just getting bored if I'm home and no one else is here to keep me company. So, alas, that's why I've been on Twitter these last couple of days more than I usually am. As well, we are prepping, we're in the early stages of prepping to move and packing up. I'm going through all of my books. And I've had quite a few people reach out to me over the months. It's been about a year now since I first put out the, let's see, I think the very first Native American video that I did was the series on Lakota Catholicism. And then months later, I followed that up with the issues around the Amazon Synod and some of the Amazonian Indian issues. So, in the controversy around that, and then in some of the people that have expressed interest, I've been asked about what my sources were. And honestly, it's a long laundry list of sources over the years that I have come to use when it comes to my Native American studies. So, as I'm getting these books packed away, I figured it's as good a time as any to gather. This is by no means an exhaustive, comprehensive list here of all of the things that I have, but some of the best ones, some of the ones that I would recommend if you guys are interested in these topics in general. And this is going to be a bit autobiographical as well, because I kind of have my own journey into studying Native American history. The very first thing that comes to mind when I was thinking about, well, where did all of my interest in this originate from? And I think it originates from the earliest, the earliest memories that I have, and I wish I had thought about it. I'd grab the picture. When I was about like 3 or 4, my very first like active Halloween, I was an Indian for that Halloween. There's a picture of it somewhere where all the various kids, and I was an Indian. I had my little feather and stuff like that. So somewhere there was an interest way in the way back. But my first like young adult interest in it, I remember, well, gosh, I guess it would even been before I was a young adult. My mother had bought a copy. This would have been early 90s. There was a movie that came out called The Last of the Mohicans. Some of you may have seen it. It's a good movie, Daniel Day-Lewis. My mom was a huge fan of that movie. Well, she also bought the paperback book, and I couldn't have been but like maybe 9 or 10 years old when that came out. But I had that paperback copy of it. That I had back then, and it's saying I've got a weak internet signal, so hopefully this doesn't drop out completely. But anyways, I remember I was super fascinated. The cover of that book, I wish I still had that copy of it. It was a green paperback, and on the front image it was this Indian, and he's got like the full headdress and he's leaning against a tree. There's a river stream in front of him. I looked at this image, like I was like, for some reason this image just fascinated me. He had his like satchel of arrows and his bow next to him, and he's just kind of like looking up and he's in the woods and he's just like looking up, like pondering life or something. I'm not for sure, but for whatever reason that image just fascinated me. Again, I wish, just for like sentimental reasons, that I still had it. If any of you guys have that copy, let me know. We can do a swap out. We can trade. I'll give you this copy, just a random Signet Classic copy. This was, again, it was just, it's not like a significant. I think it's just one of those like mass produced, maybe a Signet or something like that. I'm not for sure who published it, but it's green and it's got that Native American on the front, like just sort of staring up, questioning life. And anyways, I was just super fascinated with that cover. And I used to read, this was about 9 or 10 years old, maybe a little bit older, I'm not for sure, but I used to read. I never got past the first paragraph because at that age, I wasn't really, and I didn't grab my reading glasses, so I'm not for sure how well I can be able to see this, but I would read this first paragraph of this book, The Last of the Mohicans, over and over and over again. Let me read you this first paragraph. Chapter 1, Last of the Mohicans. It was that the toils and dangers of the wilderness were to be encountered before the adverse hosts could meet. A wide and apparently impervious boundary of forests severed the possessions of the hostile province of France and England. The hardy colonialist and the trained European who fought at his side frequently expended months in struggling against the rapids of the streams or in infecting the rugged passes on the mountains, in quest of an opportunity to exhibit their courage in a more martial conflict. But emulating the patience and self-denial of the practiced native warriors, they learned to overcome every difficulty, and it would seem that in time there was no recess of the wood so dark, would play so lovely, that it might claim exemption from the inroads of those who helped pledge their blood and satiate their vengeance, or to uphold the cold and selfish policy of the distant monarchs of Europe. So I would read that paragraph over and over and over again. I don't ask me why. I was kind of like crazy about this book. Finally, years later, I read the book. It's a fantastic book. This kind of got me started in my interests. So I would say, absolutely, if you're interested in Native American studies, this is the East. This is like the James Fenimore Cooper's writing kind of about the demise of the Native Americans in the East during his time. It was sort of the last of, like, I mean, the last of the Mohicans, right? It's the last great hurrah of them. After that, I kind of like, well, he's got a series of novels called the Leather Stocking Tales, and they're of various quality. The Pioneers was not very good. Um, what was the other ones? I can't think of the other. It's like two or three more. This one, though, The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. This is another one of his. By Leather Stocking, it just means it was his tale of Hawkeye. He's like the main character in Last of the Mohicans in these other novels. And Hawkeye was a white Europeaner who was raised by the Mohican Indians. And he was one of the best shots in the woods. It's like this very like fanciful tale of, you know, the white man raised by the American Indians, and he learns the native ways and things like that. So a very romanticized version of like what that life would have been like. But totally got me started down that path. Later in high school, I became friends with two guys, unrelated to one another. One was a Cherokee, full blood Cherokee Indian. And he was an interesting cat, but he wasn't like super, like, we didn't talk a whole lot about his Native American blood. It would come up occasionally. But I had another friend who was like maybe a third Native American. He was mostly like white Europeaners, but somewhere he had some Native. You could even like see it. Like he had like jet black hair. It was like in his blood, but he was mostly white. He was super into it though, and he kind of got the ball rolling for me. One of the first books that I bought, I probably would have been 17, 18 when I read this, was George Catlin's North American Indians. And this is like a series of essays and journals, mostly journals that Catlin wrote. He traveled extensively among various tribes. He's got some really phenomenal paintings. Don't know how many are in this book. There's a few, and they don't really do a good job because these are not colorized. But if you find the colorized, I've actually seen in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, there's some of his works are in that museum. And his paintings are great. They're like, he would go around to the tribes and he would ask to paint them, paint their portraits. And you get these great portraits of individuals. This is Stumikawaks, a buffalo, Blackfoot. He's a Blackfoot. So he would travel to the different tribes, write what their lifestyles were like, and sort of you would see the differences from this tribe to that tribe and their customs and their dress and all the various things about them. There's some bias in his book. I mean, he was a Europeaner, and this was a time when there was a conflict, but this is a pretty, overall, for a Europeaner writing at the time, it's pretty neutral work, I find. He's not, you can see he respects them. There's going to be some caricatures. I mean, it's just the nature of the way that the Native Americans were caricatured the Wasichus. Wasichus caricatured the Native Americans. It was just kind of how people how they rolled back then. Another one that I came across very early on when I sort of got interested. It's like, okay, so I'm reading about the history. I had a book, I can't find it. It was a massive tome of just like all the different tribes and cultures and pictures. It was like an encyclopedic type book, and I don't know where it is. I haven't been able to find it since I've been going through all of my books, but that sort of got me interested in the sort of spiritual aspects and the moral aspects of how some of these tribes lived. This was a very, I found this one to be a very great. This is called the, I don't know how good these lighting is. This one's called the Lakota Way: Stories and Lessons for Living, Wisdom on Ethics and Character by John Marshall III. Marshall himself is a Lakota, and he just goes through various. I covered these in the Native American on the Catholic Lakota Catholicism series that I did on on their spirituality, and I mean this is just a series of various like lessons that you would sit with grandma in the tent in the winters as a young child, and grandma would tell you the stories, right, of the people, and these are the kind of stories. So it's these various stories, and there's always like lessons in the stories. It's like life lessons from grandma, and Marshall collected these stories in this book. So that's what this is. It's called the Lakota Way. As well, very similar to that, there's this one called Navajo Folk Tales that I've always really enjoyed kind of flipping through. Navajo were more like, if you're familiar, they're more New Mexico, Arizona, so more like desert life than some of these other tribes that I've been interested in, which are more Eastern or Midwest. But the desert tribes, they had their own cultures and their own unique ways of doing things. Let's see. So, as far as, well, okay. One of my favorite things to study is I've got two groups that I'm primarily studied in and interested in, and one is the Lakota, which I'll talk about in a minute. The second is the Comanches. And without a doubt, the best book that I have on the Comanches is Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn. And this is a phenomenal work. This is Empire of the Summer Moon, Quanah Parker, and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history. Without a doubt, the Comanches, if you guys are interested in Native American stuff, like we're just talking about Native American culture and history, Comanches are your people. Super, super interesting history. Really, they're like the self-made tribe. They were originally, I think they were originally part of the Cheyennes or the Shoshans, and they were not a very like formidable. They were like picked on. Other tribes abused them, and then somewhere in the 18th, 19th century, they got a hold of the Spanish horse, and nobody really knows because nobody like there was no Europeaners there at the time. Like some Spanish horses had like gotten loose and they were running across the prairie, and somewhere along the way the Comanches took to the horse, and they took to the horse like nobody else's business. Like they it changed the entire landscape. They became the largest empire of an American native tribe that's ever existed. Comanchera, it was known as. And these guys, man, they were absolutely like ruthless and brutal, and they're almost comparable to like the Mongols on horseback. They just come out of this, like, if you know anything about the grasslands of Texas, it was such a like desolate and formidable place. White people like absolutely just feared it. Nobody wanted to go into the grasslands. Well, the Comanches like owned the grasslands, and they owned the buffalo there. And anybody that was on their like boundaries of this empire that they had created were at like risk of being terrorized by the Comanches. They were just known as, you just don't mess with them, right? And even like later when you start getting into like the cowboy movies of the early 20th century, they still had that legacy. Like my favorite, like one of my all-time favorite movies is the John Wayne movie, The Searchers. And that's all about the Comanche, right? John Wayne and the I can't let me what's John Wayne's voice? Well, we're gonna go after some Comanche, right? And that John Wayne, like they had that reputation. Whites feared them, the Mexicans feared them, the other tribes feared them. And this is just a great book at like what it was like to be within the tribe and then what it was like to live around them. As a matter of fact, the Texas Rangers, the famous Texas Rangers, a white people, these white men that coalesced together to try to protect white settlers in the region from the Comanches. So wonderful. S.C. Gordon hasn't done a lot of books, but he's a great like narrative style of historical telling. There's another one too, actually, by this author. I couldn't find it. I'm going to butcher this name, but it's Pekka Hamalainen. Pekka Hamalainen, and he wrote a book called Empire. I think Comanche Empire is and I can't find that one. But he also, oh yeah, Comanche Empire. There it is. But he also wrote this book called Lakota America, a new history of indigenous power. And this is another great one. Like I absolutely recommend this book. I don't know. He's a Rhodes professor, Oxford University Press. So, when it comes to the Lakotas, they're the other tribe that's really fascinating to me. Now, the Comanches were like a very, I would say, they're like, think of Sparta, right? Think of a culture that's literally just given itself to war. And that's all that they're focused about. And they're focused about on expanding their empire and conquering people. And what little cultural practices that they had, they weren't that like, they themselves were not that interested in if it didn't like if it didn't excel their chances of victory in battle. So with the Comanches, that's like, and even, so when they would raid a village, for example, what they would do is they would come in, all of the men, adult men, gone, slaughtered. Women were assaulted, probably slaughtered. Some of them were taken captives. It kind of seemed to be just whatever happened, happened. And then babies were slaughtered. Now, if you were a young child between like, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 to like puberty age, they would take you and they would like adopt you into the tribe and you would be raised into the tribe. But babies, they had no, because babies were a liability. You had to like tend to babies. They couldn't do all of that. But if you were, and that's why quite a few whites ended up in Comanche. As a matter of fact, the greatest of all of their leaders in Comanchera was this guy in the front cover here, Quanah Parker, who had a white mother, famously had a white mother, and he was half white. And he ended up being one of the greatest commanders that the Comanches ever had. And that's just how they rolled. I mean, that's like, so they would take, because their women, the Comanche women, their lifestyle was so harsh and so brutal that they always had a hard time keeping their population up. Comanche women were known to miscarry a lot, and the infant mortality was very high. So they would try to keep their numbers up basically through Like by the time a male hit puberty, they saw that as a liability. If you were a young man, 13, 14, 15, gone, they would kill you. But if you were below that age where they could still kind of like manipulate you, bring you, enculturate you into their tribe, they'd bring you in and raise you. So you could easily come up against a Comanche that was blonde hair, blue eyes. It was kind of a rarity, but they were there. Cynthia Parker was Quanah Parker's mother's name, and she's got an amazing, so they tell her story in this. She's got an amazing story. She was kidnapped as a young child. Her whole family basically slaughtered. She was raised up in the Comanche village. Later on, the whites like rescued her, but she had been raised in Comanchera her whole life, and she despised white society. It's such a weird thing. Like she was constantly trying to get back to Comanchera. The end of her life is like very like tragic and just kind of a sad tale. But anyways, the Lakotas, on the other hand, though, unlike the Comanches, had a very rich and vibrant culture, and they're the ones that they love to dress like some of the famous dress that we think of when we think of Native Americans. That's Lakota, that's Sioux, that's the dancing and the chanting. But they were another, not all of the, like, we tend to think of Native Americans as a horse culture, but the horse was actually a reintroduction. Europeaners, especially the Spanish, reintroduced the horse back into the native population. Horses had been extinct for centuries at that point. But not all of the cultures took to the horse. The two that did, the Comanche and the Lakota, that really took to the horse, so it became so dominant that in white people's minds it became a feature. So now to this day, and then it's said that they were the most amazing men on horseback. It's kind of sad by the time that you get to the invention of the camera, of like film. None of the real old time Comanche guys were left alive. The Lakota guys were kind of gone at that point. So we don't have any footage of what it would have been like to see them on horseback. But the stories are pretty phenomenal of what their capabilities were on horseback. I love reading about it. I absolutely would have loved to have been able to see it. There's one guy, I can't think of his name. I just didn't get any notes together for this because I just jumped on live. He's not Native American. I think he's like Danish or something like that, or maybe he's like Dutch. But anyways, you could easily find him because if you go online, he is a world famous archer at archery, and he has in the last several years gotten interested in the Comanche style of archery warfare. And it was said that Comanches could put like 4 to 5 they could put 4 arrows in the air before the first one that they fired dropped. And that's just like, you think about, that's like a machine gun, right? Like trying to get off arrows that fast. But this guy is like a world famous, and he's done some work. The problem is that he wasn't raised on horseback the way that these guys would have been raised on horseback. So he's attempting. I haven't watched his videos in a long time, but he's phenomenal at what he does with archery. But he was trying to learn some of the Comanche style of archery, and then trying to even like learn how to do it on horseback. So he was doing some interesting things. I would recommend going, at least watching his, because he was definitely able to, because you think about that and you're like, there's no way somebody gets 4 arrows in the air at one time, but he does it. He does it, and he hits his targets as well too. I want to say I saw him at least do 3, maybe 4, where he has the arrows. The first arrow is still in the air when the fourth one fires, and he's still managing to hit his targets. An amazing thing to see. That's what these guys would have been like. So yeah, the Lakotas, Lakota America. That's definitely one that's worth reading. Then as you get into kind of the Catholic stuff, I have a few sources for that. One really good one, and it's probably because of the gloss, it's probably going to be a glare, but this one is called The Jesuit Mission to the Lakota Sioux, a study of the pastoral ministry, 1886 to 1945, by Ross Enochs. This is a really good book. I leaned into this one pretty heavily for the series that I put out, and he kind of, he gives a very like positive. I mean, he's clearly a Catholic writer himself. and he gives a very positive spin to any of the Catholic things that are happening on the tribal reservations. You know, some of these things are filtered through lenses. One side is like everything was horrible and what the Catholic Church did was awful, and he kind of gives a different perspective where even with like the boarding school stuff, he shows that actually it wasn't all that bad. And I lean towards his side of things in terms of it not being as bad, at least via the church. The problem becomes, and I go into that in the whole series, the problem really becomes that the church gets tied up with the US government in terms, at least in terms of how the Native Americans themselves view it. They don't view this distinction between, um, the church and the government are two unique entities. And this it's complicated because earlier on they clearly did. Like the Lakotas in particular, and many of the other tribes loved the priests. They loved the Catholic priests in particular, and they knew the difference between the Catholic priests and the U.S. government. Over time, though, especially when you get into the 1960s and 70s and the Pan Indian movement and the rise of all of that, things get complicated because the Pan Indian group, while there were serious problems that needed to be addressed, the Pan Indian group doesn't do a very good job of differentiating and making those distinctions at times. They tend to lump all of white culture in together as this one giant thing. So there's that. There's also, this is more of a primary source. This one's super fascinating. This is called Lakotas, Black Robes, and Holy Women. And this is a series of like diaries, German reports from the Indian missions in South Dakota, 1886 to 1900. So it's a collection of these priests and these nuns and their diaries. Super interesting. Relied on that one quite a bit. As well, just two really important works. My wife and I are going to do a review on this one pretty soon, but this is John Nehrhart's Black Elk Speaks. If you're going to interested in this stuff as far as Catholic stuff goes, you kind of have to know about Black Elk. He's he's working his way through the cause towards canonization, servant of God at this point, and looking like the cause. There's not much that looks like it's going to stop it. So, probably going to be the first male native born of any race in the United States to be canonized. We don't have any male saints, unfortunately, in the United States, at least those that were born here. We have some that were born elsewhere and traveled here, but we don't have any that are native born yet. We have a few blessed, some servants of God, and things like that. But Black Elk's on his way, and Black Elk Speaks, we're going to do a review on that one. Wife and I are reading it now just to she hasn't read it before, so we're reading it to each other. That's going to be our next book review. So I'm going to save the review on that for that. But I would definitely recommend this one by Father Steltenkamp. This is Nicholas Black Elk, medicine man, missionary, mystic. And this is great. He's a Catholic priest himself that wrote this. So he, unlike Nehrhart, very much writes it from the perspective of Black Elk as a man that in midlife becomes Catholic. So very excellent work. Anyways, guys, that's what I got for you. I think that's all I got. If I find some more, I'll shoot them out again. But I'd had several people ask me about what I would recommend as far as a reading list. And I think that's a good start for any of you guys that are interested in this stuff. I wish I had that encyclopedia because that's like everybody. That's like every tribe in the United States. But anyways, that's a good starting point for some of you guys. Hope you enjoyed this. God bless you all. Take care.